One story, The Hunter's Curse. My name is Jake Thompson, and I've lived in Pine Hollow, a small village nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, my entire life. Hunting was more than just a pastime here. It was a rite of passage. So when I heard tales of a massive buck roaming the woods just beyond the village, I couldn't resist the urge to go after it. The locals whispered about something strange living in those woods, but I was too proud to heed their warnings. I set out early one morning, the chill of autumn biting at my skin as I hiked up the mountain trail. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. Hours passed, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant calls of birds. But as the sun dipped low in the sky, an eerie stillness settled over the woods. No birds, no rustling of small creatures, just silence. I spotted the buck as the last light of day filtered through the trees. It was enormous, with a rack of antlers that looked like they could pierce the sky. My heart pounded as I raised my rifle, steadying my aim. But just as I was about to pull the trigger, something moved in the corner of my eye. A shadow, swift and unnatural. The buck bolted, disappearing into the thick underbrush, and I cursed under my breath. I moved toward where I had seen the shadow, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. There, in a small clearing, stood a man. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and matted. But it was his eyes that froze me in place, wild, bloodshot, and filled with a primal hunger. Beside him stood a goat, its fur black as night, its eyes reflecting a deep malevolence. "You're trespassing," the man rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "I didn't mean any harm, just hunting." He took a step closer, the goat following in eerie synchronization. "This is our land. You shouldn't have come here." Before I could react, the man lunged at me with a speed that defied his gaunt appearance. The goat charged at my legs, knocking me off balance. I fired my rifle in a panic, but the bullet went wide, disappearing into the trees. The man's hands were on my throat, his grip iron-like as I struggled to break free. The goat bleated, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the stillness of the forest. I managed to push him off, scrambling to my feet and running as fast as I could. The trees blurred around me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them behind me, the man and the goat, their footsteps impossibly light, yet always right on my heels. I burst out of the woods and into the village, collapsing on the porch of the general store. The villagers gathered around, their faces pale as I tried to explain what had happened. They didn't need to hear the details. They already knew. The old man sitting on the store's steps nodded gravely, muttering something about the hunter's curse. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. The man and the goat were once part of the village, a hunter and his prized companion. But they had ventured too deep into the forest, driven by greed and bloodlust, and had never returned. Some say they had struck a deal with something dark, others that they had become one with the forest itself. But whatever they were now, they were no longer human. And now, every night, as the shadows stretch across Pine Hollow, I hear them outside my window. The soft bleating of a goat, the whisper of footsteps in the leaves. They're waiting for me to return to the forest, to finish what I started. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back. 2-story, The Beast of Willow Creek. I've hunted in these woods all my life, but something about this season felt different. Willow Creek, a small, forgotten village nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was usually a quiet place, where the biggest concern was whether the deer would be plentiful. But this year, something was off. The air was colder, sharper, and the forest seemed darker, as if it held secrets best left buried. My name is Jack Turner, and I'd been hunting these woods since I was a kid. It was early November, and the leaves had just finished falling. I packed my gear, kissed my wife goodbye, and headed out before dawn. The plan was simple. Track a buck I'd been eyeing for weeks and bring home some meat before the first snow. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the familiar paths seemed unfamiliar, twisted somehow, like the woods themselves had shifted. I shook it off, chalking it up to the eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. There were no birds singing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the frost-covered leaves. After hours of tracking, I finally spotted the buck. It was a magnificent creature, larger than any I'd seen before, with antlers that seemed to stretch toward the sky. I raised my rifle, my heart pounding with excitement. But as I peered through the scope, I saw something that made me lower my gun. Standing behind the buck, barely visible through the thick fog, was a figure. At first I thought it was a man, but then I saw the eyes, yellow, glowing eyes staring right at me. The creature's body was covered in matted fur, and its face, it was human-like but twisted, distorted, with the head of a goat. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The buck bolted, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, as if waiting. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, without warning, it let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my chest. The sound broke my paralysis, and I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the woods, panting and drenched in sweat. I looked back, expecting the creature to be right behind me, but the forest was still and silent once more. I returned home, shaken and pale, but I couldn't tell my wife what I'd seen. How could I? She would think I'd lost my mind. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I could never set foot in those woods again. The next day, I heard that Old Man Jenkins had gone missing. They found his cabin torn apart, his hunting gear scattered around like he'd left in a hurry. The villagers whispered about the beast of Willow Creek, an old legend that I'd always dismissed as just a story. But now, I wasn't so sure. As the days passed, more hunters went missing, their bodies never found, only their bloodied gear left behind. The village fell into a state of fear, and the woods, once a source of pride and sustenance, became a place of terror. I tried to forget what I saw, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew the truth. The beast of Willow Creek was real, and it was hunting us. One night, as I sat by the fire, trying to keep the nightmares at bay, I heard a noise outside, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. My blood ran cold as I realized it had followed me home, and then the door creaked open. 3-story, The Beast of Willow Creek. I never believed the stories. They called it The Beast of Willow Creek, but I figured it was just another tale spun by the old-timers to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But when the deer in our area started vanishing, I had to see for myself. It was early November, the air cold enough to bite. I packed my gear and headed out to the edge of Willow Creek, where the trees grow thick and the fog clings to the ground like a shroud. My grandpa used to say that the forest had a way of swallowing people whole, but I chalked it up to his age. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the usual sounds of nature fell eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the frost-bitten ground. My breath fogged the air as I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers through the woods. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a flash of movement in the distance, low to the ground but fast. I raised my rifle, my heart hammering in my chest as I carefully stalked closer. The thing was huge, much larger than any deer I'd ever seen. Its fur was matted, almost black, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent yellow light. It moved with an unnatural grace, slinking through the underbrush as if it were part of the shadows themselves. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trigger, something deep inside me screaming not to shoot. But fear clouded my judgment. I fired. The blast echoed through the trees, and the beast let out a sound that was more human than animal, a howl of pain and anger. It charged, and I barely had time to reload before it was on me. Its breath was hot, reeking of decay, and its claws sliced through the air as I stumbled backward, trying to get away. I fell hard, my back slamming into the frozen earth. The beast loomed over me, its eyes boring into mine with a hatred that felt ancient. My hands fumbled for the rifle, but the creature was too fast. It knocked the weapon aside, and I braced myself for the end. But then, as suddenly as it had attacked, it stopped. The beast sniffed the air, its eyes narrowing before it let out a low growl. It backed away slowly, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me gasping and terrified. I lay there for what felt like hours before I could move again. When I finally got to my feet, I found my rifle shattered, my body bruised, but miraculously unharmed. The beast was gone, but the horror remained. I stumbled back to the village, my mind reeling from what had happened. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but when I tried to speak, no words came out. The fear had settled deep in my bones, a cold that wouldn't leave. No one believes me when I say I saw the beast of Willow Creek. They say the woods play tricks on a man's mind, especially after dark. But I know what I saw. I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I know I'll never set foot in those woods again.